It's very nice to join you for the 5th webinar in our series. If you are new to this series, by the way, my name is Hari-kirtana, and I will be your host for this webinar series on the Bhagavad-gita. My intention is to make the Bhagavad-gita accessible, to help everyone to unlock the secrets of the Bhagavad-gita that are hiding in plain sight. Throw some light on them so that you can see them. If you want to understand the Gita and how to practically apply the Bhagavad-gita in your life, I hope that you are in the right place, whether you've been reading the Bhagavad-gita for many years, whether you have been promising yourself that you would read it, or that you're just getting started with it. Any situation, I certainly hope that you'll find something of value in these webinars so that you will be able to deepen your experience. Raise your hands, please, one more time, just to make sure that you are seeing me full screen right now. Yay, okay, very good. Okay, thank you very much. You can adjust your audio settings in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, just in case you need to make a change. There's no need for you to have your microphone activated or your video camera. I cannot see you and nobody else can see you, at least as far as I know. You've all found the raise your hand function, and your viewing options also can change. We have a Q&A section. I hope you can all see. And Jessica, please type something into the, all right, one of you Jessicas I know is going to take this very literally, and I always appreciate that. Too many Jessicas. Well, there's no such thing as too many Jessicas. That's simply not possible. Okay, good. I'm glad we are in agreement on that. Okay, here we go. I've got a question for you. I have a poll that I would like for you to answer, and here it is. It's a simple multiple choice question. Would you like to save your family members from death? Let's see how much you. Okay, we have some doubters insofar as family goes. All right, very good. Now, of course, this follow-up question would go to motivation, but I'm going to skip that part. This is the dilemma that Arjuna finds himself facing. He would like very much to save his family members from death. All right, I think we've got everyone. Yes, all righty. Thank you very much for playing. We have some wonderful parting gifts for you. All right, so this is where we left Arjuna off. Last week, showstoppers in the Bhagavad-gita. We talked about sin as a loaded word, and karma, and how sin in the Western conception is a little different from karma in the Eastern conception. The social order of Arjuna's world, so that we would have some frame of reference, some understanding of where Arjuna is coming from and what it is he is seeking to preserve. We spoke about the depiction of women in the Bhagavad-gita and the assumption of a patriarchal orientation to the Bhagavad-gita specifically, and yoga wisdom texts in general. We will pick up tonight's program at the start of chapter 2, the Yoga of Discernment. We'll cover verses 1 through 12. We'll look at Arjuna's confusion, which is the 5th reason why he doesn't fight, because he just doesn't know what to do. He's basically a deer in the headlights at this point. And his request for guidance. We'll look at Krishna's very first instruction in the Bhagavad-gita, And we will return once again to the issue of detachment from family affection, as promised. Okay. Here's another question for you. Do you think attachment to family is an impediment to yoga? Now, this is a rhetorical question, so you don't actually have to answer it. But I want you to think about it. If it is, why is it an impediment? How is it an impediment? Why might a yoga wisdom text suggest that it's an impediment? And if not, why not? And how is it not? The Bhagavad-gita asks difficult questions and poses seemingly very odd situations. You know, Arjuna's problem in his practice of yoga, his obstacle to yoga, is he doesn't want to kill his grandfather. Why is that a problem in yoga or anything else? So it's no wonder that Arjuna is confused if he's thinking that this is a problem, because I would be confused. Wouldn't you be confused? All right. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. I'm just going to read them all the way through, and I'll be reading my translation. Then I'm going to go back into each verse, and I'm going to add some commentary to each verse. And I'll be referencing A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gita as it is commentary for most of this. Just so you know, I'm just not making the commentary up, and it's not just something I'm pulling out of a hat. That's the particular reference for much of what I will have to say when I come back and do the commentary for each verse. Now, by the way, this is the way I recommend that you read a yoga wisdom text like the Bhagavad-gita, or the Bhagavad-gita specifically, if you have an edition that is laid out as verse, commentary, verse, commentary, verse, commentary, and especially if the commentaries are detailed. Go through the verses in the chapter first, then go back and read the verse and the commentary and the verse and the commentary. You just get a much nicer sense of the flow of the text, and you'll be able to remember what is being spoken about, what's the topic under discussion, much more easily that way. Okay, so here we go. Beginning with verse 1, Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna overwhelmed by compassion, his tear-filled eyes cast down in despair, Madhusudana, Krishna, spoke to him. Verse 2, the blessed Lord Krishna said, my dear Arjuna, how has this weakness come upon you at such a critical moment? It is unbefitting a man of your noble character, and will lead you not to heavenly glory, but to disgrace. 3. O son of Prthā, Arjuna, do not succumb to this unbecoming impotence. Banish this petty weakness from your heart, and rise and breathe fire on your enemies. Arjuna said, verse 4, O killer of the demon Madhu, Bhishma and Drona are worthy of my worship. How can I counteract in battle such men with arrows, O slayer of enemies? 5. Even though they are motivated by selfish desires, they are still noble teachers. I would be better off living as a beggar in this world than to live having slain these great souls who are my mentors. For whatever pleasure I might enjoy thereafter would be tainted with their blood. 6. Nor do I know which would be better, conquering them or being conquered by them. If we kill the sons of Dhritarashtra, who stand before here stand here before us on the battlefield, then we would surely not wish to live. 7. My heart is afflicted by a wretched weakness. My thoughts are in disarray as I try to determine which path is virtuous. Therefore, I am asking you to tell me what course of action would serve the greatest good. Please tell me, for I am now your disciple, a soul surrendered unto you. 8. I cannot envision how the grief that is drying up my senses might be dispelled, for it will remain even if I win an earthly kingdom of unrivaled affluence and reign with sovereignty on par with the celestial beings. 9. Sanjaya said, having thus spoken to the Lord of the senses, Krishna, the conqueror of sleep, who scorches his foes, Arjuna, said, O Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. So those are our first 9 verses of the second chapter. If you're following along in your edition of the Gita, take note of the translation that I have just shared with you and the translation you have before you. See how the different translations might change the meaning, illuminate some part of the verse in a different way. Good exercise to do. All right, now I'm going to go through each verse one at a time. So in verse 1, the name Madhusudana used for Krishna is significant. So that verse was, Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna overwhelmed by compassion, his tear-filled eyes cast down in despair, Madhusudana spoke to him. So Krishna killed a demon named Madhu in his childhood. If you read about Krishna's childhood pastimes, there are many such instances where he is killing demons who are sent to kill him. And each of these demons has both a symbolic meaning to go with the literal idea that a demon came to where Krishna was living as a child, seeking him out to try to kill him. So Arjuna wants Krishna to kill the demon of his misunderstanding, which is the representation of this particular demon. In verse 2, the significant phrase is how Krishna is described before he speaks. Śrī-bhagavan uvāca is the Sanskrit phrase, which is often translated as the Blessed Lord. It may also be translated as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And both of those translations, in my opinion, are perfectly valid. I'll read the verse again. The Blessed Lord, Krishna, said, my dear Arjuna, how has this weakness come upon you at such a critical moment? It is unbefitting a man of your noble character and will lead you not to heavenly glory, but to disgrace. So when Dhritarashtra speaks the first verse of the Bhagavad-gita, then the Sanskrit is Dhritarashtra uvāca. When Sanjaya speaks, Sanjaya uvāca. When Arjuna speaks, Arjuna uvāca. But when Krishna speaks, it is śrī-bhagavan uvāca, indicating Krishna's position. So there are 3 aspects of the absolute truth in this conception of the absolute truth in the Vedic culture, in the Vedic literature, the spiritual tradition from which the Bhagavad-gita comes. And throughout the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna will refer to all 3 of them. The first, Brahman, the glow of the Supreme, the undifferentiated oneness that jnana yogis who study the Vedas and practice meditation and austerities want to merge into, to become one with. So this is the effulgence, the glow of the absolute reality, the ground of being. Then the second aspect is Param Atma. Param, paramount, Atma, soul, consciousness. So the supreme consciousness, the all-pervasive localized aspect. Now that may sound like an oxymoron. How can something be all-pervasive and localized at the same time? So in this conception, what you have is the idea of the Supreme Person manifest, present in the hearts of all living beings and within each atomic particle of matter. Whatever is the smallest possible unit, measure of matter, within that matter, the Supreme Person resides. And then Bhagavan. Bhagavan means the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or that person who is complete in every respect, the person who has all qualities in infinite quantity and absolute perfection. Here's another way to think about these three aspects of the absolute truth. It's one absolute truth. So it's not like there's three different entities here. It's one entity, but three aspects: an impersonal, a localized personal, and a supreme, singular, unique person. So the sunshine is like Brahman, the glow of the sun. And then the surface of the sun can be considered like Paramatma. And then the sun, the surface of the sun is where the corona originates. It pops off of the surface of the sun. And then the core of the sun is the hottest part. It's really where all the energy of the sun originates. So this phrase, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or specifically just the word Godhead. Godhead means the source of Godness, where all the qualities of God originate and from which they emanate. So that's a good way to understand Bhagavan. So Krishna's position is that of Bhagavan, but not just Bhagavan, śrī-bhagavan. Remember, this is often translated as the Blessed Lord. Well, if Bhagavan is the core, is the source of all Godness, who could possibly bless this Supreme Person? The answer is the goddess of fortune. The feminine aspect of the absolute truth is represented in the sound Shri. So the opulence of the absolute is bestowed by the feminine aspect of the absolute. Verse 3 was, O son of Prthā, Arjuna, do not succumb to this unbecoming impotence. Banish this petty weakness from your heart. Rise and breathe fire on your foes. So Arjuna is the scorcher of enemies. Son of Prthā indicates his noble birth. Prthā is another name for Kunti, whom we spoke about in a previous webinar. And she and his father, Pandu, are kshatriyas, warrior class. And a son of a kshatriya who does not fight is a kshatriya in name only. So Krishna is giving him a pep talk. He's trying to remind him, hey, wait a minute, you're a warrior. You come from a family of warriors. Your natural thing is to fight. So come on, get it together. Now, the other thing is Prthā, Kunti Devi, is Krishna's aunt. And therefore, Krishna and Arjuna are cousins. So they have a very intimate familial relationship as well as being friends. It's also clear that Krishna does not approve of the misplaced compassion that Arjuna has for his family members across the battlefield and his teachers and such like that. So now the conversation bounces back to Arjuna, and he's going to offer these arguments. Arjuna said, "O killer of the demon Madhu, Bhishma and Drona are worthy of my worship. How can I counterattack such men with arrows in battle, O slayer of enemies?" So his argument is based on principles of honor and religiosity. Elders and teachers should be respected. Even if they attack you, it is improper in Arjuna's world to counterattack a superior, someone who is your elder or your teacher. And he kind of implies, like, would you attack your own grandfather or attack your own teacher? This sounds like a reasonable argument. In verses 5 and 6, he goes further into this misplaced compassion. 5, even though they are motivated by selfish desire, they are still noble teachers. I would be better off living as a beggar in this world than to live having slain these great souls who are my mentors. For whatever pleasure I might enjoy thereafter would be tainted with their blood. So one of the things Arjuna is missing here, he's glossing over the idea that, well, you know, they're motivated by selfish desires, but still. And actually in this culture, elders and teachers may be disqualified by precisely the kind of selfish desires or poor decision-making that has taken place here. In verse 6, Arjuna says, "Nor do we know which would be better, conquering them or being conquered by them. If we kill the sons of Dhritarashtra, who stand here before us on the battlefield, then we would surely not wish to live." Now, this is pretty remarkable when you consider how many times the sons of Dhritarashtra have tried to kill Arjuna and his brothers. So Arjuna is demonstrating saintly qualities. He's compassionate, even above and beyond the call of normal compassion. He's really stretching to continue to maintain a humble attitude towards his teacher and his grandfather, even though they've taken the wrong side. This is Arjuna's qualification. This idea that he's so renounced that he would be willing to walk away and just live a life as a mendicant, begging for a living, which is what he would have to do if he lost anyway. So in verse 7, Arjuna continues, "My heart is afflicted by wretched weakness. My thoughts are in disarray as I try to determine which path is virtuous. Therefore, I am asking you to tell me what course of action would serve the greatest good." So again, Arjuna's saintly character. He's not looking for something that's a fix for winning the battle. He's looking for service to the greatest good. "Please tell me, for I am now your disciple, a soul surrendered unto you." So in this verse, there's a word used to describe the forest fire of material existence. And, you know, a forest fire can just start just by itself, practically, just by nature taking its course, you know, bamboo sticks rubbed together, lightning strikes. The blaze happens, nobody wants it, and it's not set by anyone, but still, it takes place. So the perplexities of life are also like that. We don't want problems. Problems just show up, seemingly all by themselves. So yoga wisdom texts advise us that we should approach someone who knows something more than we know for guidance in order to navigate our way through the problems of life that seem to just come uninvited. Arjuna wants to protect his family members. That's his conception of the greatest good. Somehow or other, let's figure out how nobody dies here. And this idea of family affection in yoga from the standpoint of renunciation is regarded as a knot, a granthi, that binds one to material consciousness or to identifying the self as being one's body, and therefore identifying oneself as being related to everyone who's got a relationship through your body, family members. Verse 8. I cannot envision how the grief that is drying up my senses might be dispelled, for it will remain even if I win an earthly kingdom of unrivaled affluence and reign with sovereignty on par with the celestial beings. So he can't figure it out. He knows the codes of dharma. He knows the codes of righteousness and religion, and he also knows the codes of politics. He's a politician. And all his knowledge of moral codes not helping here. He can't figure out what is the right rule to apply in this situation. And the point of this is to show us how formulaic religiosity, wealth, or a big army, or anything else that one might acquire in the material world, not enough to save us from these four problems. These are the four key problems of life in the material world: birth, old age, disease, and death. Birth is actually considered a problem. And the reason that birth is considered a problem is because you're going to die if you are born. It's as simple as that. The number one cause of death in the world is birth. So finally, verse 9, Arjuna's incapacitation. Sanjaya, now reporting to Dhritarashtra, says, having thus spoken to the Lord of the senses, Krishna, the conqueror of sleep who scorches his foes, Arjuna, said, O Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. So Dhritarashtra is very happy to hear this, because if Arjuna is not going to fight, then his sons will win by default. And that's exactly how Dhritarashtra would like this to end. However, this word that Sanjaya uses to describe Arjuna, he's trying to let him know that Arjuna actually can rise to the occasion here, that he can overcome the problem that he's got. He uses the word parantapaha, which means he has the ability to kill his enemies. It is latent, but it's there. And he uses that to indicate that it's going to come out, that Dhritarashtra shouldn't celebrate yet. Okay, so let's stop here for just a second just to see if any of you have any questions. Please go ahead and type something into the Q&A box if you would like to ask anything about verses 1 through 9 in the second chapter, Arjuna's confusion and capitulation to his confusion. And now he's asking Krishna, basically saying, it's completely beyond my control. I don't know what to do, and I need guidance. So anybody got anything for this? Okay, if something comes up, go ahead and type it in, and I will field it as it comes up. All right. So here's where we're at. Arjuna has dropped his bow. He's seated on the chariot. Krishna is about now to begin speaking. In verse 10, now there's a shift. So I'll read verse 10, and then speak a little bit about what's going on in verse 10. O descendant of Bharat, Dhritarashtra, the Lord of the senses, Krishna, gently smiled as if about to laugh, and then in the midst of both armies spoke to the despondent Arjuna as follows. So this is Sanjaya continuing his report to Dhritarashtra. I'm going to read directly now from the commentary in this verse in A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gita as it is, because this is a very nice commentary specifically on this passage. As friends, both of them are on the same level, but one of them volunteered to become the student of the other, and Krishna was smiling because a friend had chosen to become his disciple. As Lord of all, he is always in the superior position, as the master of everyone, Bhagavan. And yet, the Lord agrees to be a friend, a son, or a lover for a devotee who wants him in such a role. So this is kind of an interesting idea, that one can have any number of different kinds of intimate relationships with Bhagavan, the Supreme Person. And the role he takes on is actually a function of the specific desire for a relationship of his devotee. But when he was accepted as the master, the spiritual master, he at once assumed the role and talked with the disciple like the master, with gravity as it is required. So Krishna takes the seat of the teacher. It appears that the talk between the spiritual master and the disciple was openly exchanged in the presence of both armies, so that all were benefited. The talks of the Bhagavad-gita are not for any particular person, society, or community, but they are for all, and friends or enemies are equally entitled to hear them. So this is real compassion, giving transcendental knowledge even to one's enemies. And one of the things the Bhagavad-gita is going to do for us is teach us how to be equipoised in all circumstances, even when confronted with an enemy, and still be able to acknowledge their position, they're my enemy, but at the same time see them beyond their status as enemy, but also as a spirit soul under the influence of illusion, in need of transcendental knowledge. And therefore, if we can be the messengers of such knowledge, then the truly compassionate thing to do is share that knowledge, even with one's enemies. All right, so here comes the next verse. Krishna speaks again, śrī-bhagavan uvāca, the blessed Lord, Krishna, says, though your learned words have the sound of wisdom, you grieve for what is unworthy of grief. The wise lament neither for those who have passed away, nor for those who have yet to pass. So this is a very curious thing. So now I have a question for you. Please type a reply into the question and answer box. Why does Krishna say this? Why shouldn't one lament in such circumstances for either one who is living, irrespective of their condition or stage of life, or for one who has died, for one who has passed away, for one who has left their body? Take a shot at this. Why should one not lament? Meanwhile, one can envision that Krishna is happy to be the teacher of Arjuna, and Arjuna is his good friend, and yet, he's smiling and almost like rolling his eyes like, come on. You should know this. I was involved in a conversation online about this very verse. Some years ago, there was a group discussion, a moderated discussion, and the question came up: why should one not lament for a person in any stage of material existence? And there was a lot of speculation as to why that might be, a lot of different angles, people thinking up different reasons, a lot of Buddhist philosophy being applied in this particular group, even though the Gita is not a Buddhist text. And I joined the conversation and offered something to the conversation I'll share with you in just a moment. We have a few entries. Thank you very much, Jessica, because each life is temporary. Ultimately, we are eternal. That's a good answer. Now, the question becomes, how do you know this? Jill, because we are fulfilling our life's dharma based on past and current life's karma. So if it is inevitable, then what is the point of lamenting? Yeah, that's also a very reasonable way of thinking about it. Mary, because the spirit soul never dies, similar to Jessica's response. And Jessica, again, because we are eternal beings. Okay, death is part, anonymous. Death is part of the cycle. Birth, sustenance, dissolution, death. You know, a friend a long time ago asked me, if death is a natural part of life, then why do we get so upset about death? Why do we have such an aversion to death? We should just be able to accept it. It's just fulfilling our karma. It's just part of the natural order of things. Okay, so when I was involved, thank you all very much for your answers. When I was involved in this online conversation, I offered an answer that I thought was kind of obvious, that didn't occur to anyone else. If you want to know why Krishna says one should not lament for either the living or those who are no longer living, read the next verse, which is the verse we're going to chant this evening. So it is important when reading the Bhagavad-gita not to simply take verses in isolation and then try to figure out what they mean all by themselves. Usually there are clusters of verses together. And in this case, we have a pair. And the answer is then given in the very next verse. Now, when I suggested to this group that if you just read the next verse, you'll find out why Krishna says this, my comment was not actually warmly greeted. And the reason was because the whole point of this conversation was to speculate about what they thought the verse meant to them. They weren't actually very interested in trying to understand what Krishna was saying to Arjuna, and by extension to us. My suggestion, my humble request, is that as you read the Bhagavad-gita, try to hear what the author, Krishna, is telling you. Focus on what is Krishna trying to say, and how shall I understand this message, as opposed to what does it mean to me, or how have other people interpreted its meaning. So this is hearing, which in Bhakti Yoga is the first process of understanding transcendental knowledge. So I will chant And you can chant back. I will give you time to chant this back. A couple of notes now about the first line of this Sanskrit verse, which is verse number 12. The second word, tv, that's actually, the word itself is tu, tu, but the vowel becomes a V, the vowel U becomes a V in order to slide nicely into the E in eva, which is joined with the word aham, which means I. So that will now flow almost like all one sound. Remember, on the second line, if you look at the end, there's a dot under the H. That means you'll echo back a short A after a long A right before the H. Same now, and then the third line has the dot under the H, and that's going to be a short A bouncing after a short A. So here we go. Na tvevaham jatu nasam. Na tvam neme janadipaha. Na chaiva na bhavishyamaha. Sarve vayam ataparam. The translation: there has never been a time when I did not exist, nor one when you did not exist, nor one when all these kings did not exist, nor is there any possibility that in the future any of us shall ever cease to be. This is the first essential instruction of the Bhagavad-gita, and it's very important to hear and understand this instruction, because everything that proceeds in the Bhagavad-gita from this verse is hinging on this verse and its proper understanding. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about the significance of this verse and about how radical this proposition really is. So in the Bhagavad-gita's system of knowledge, to be learned or wise means to have practical knowledge of the distinction between matter and spirit, and knowledge about the ultimate source of them. And that is 3 of the 5 main topics of the Bhagavad-gita: the individual soul, the supreme soul, and matter, or the material energy. The possessor of such knowledge does not lament for the body in any stage of life. So your answers that this idea that this consciousness, the spirit soul, is eternal, whereas the life in the material body is a temporary experience, this is true as far as the Bhagavad-gita is concerned. The body is destined to be vanquished today or tomorrow or the next day or at some point. It just comes with the package. It comes into being, stays for some time, goes out of being. And therefore, because it is not permanent, eternal, it is not as important, doesn't have the same status as consciousness itself. So, the first radical aspect of this is the idea of eternal individuality. Notice, Krishna speaks about himself. I've always existed. And Arjuna, you too. You have always existed. And everyone here on the battlefield, everyone has always been. So, this is hardly the same thing as saying, you and I are one. Everyone here has the illusion of individuality, but in fact, there is no such thing as individuality. Krishna is confirming the validity of our experience as unique persons. And this should be very reassuring to us all. The idea that we have always been and will always be unique individuals. Here's the next thing. We're not created beings. There has never been a time when we did not exist. We are part of the absolute reality, and the absolute reality is eternal, has always been. We did not, now this really flies in the face of the two major paradigms that we're familiar with in Western culture, one of which is we are created by God at a point in time, and the other is we are created by a chance combination of material elements from the scientific, the hard science standpoint. And the Bhagavad-gita says no in each case, that we are actually part of the absolute reality, and therefore we have always been, we never come into being, we never go out of being. So this is a radical departure from what we're normally accustomed to. Then this idea that consciousness does not depend on matter. Matter is not the source of consciousness, and consciousness proceeds beyond the container that we are currently residing in. And the container can change up to the point of dissolving, but we will still be here. So this is also a radical idea. And then Atma, karma, and samsara are implied. The Atma is the individual soul. We're here by virtue of our karma, a reaction to a past action, which means we must have been somewhere else before we were here. Therefore, where were we? Well, the idea of birth after birth, the cycle of birth and death, samsara, which brings us to family affection. Where were you before you were here? Where were your children, if you have them, before they were here? If you're going to have children, where are they now? They're somewhere. They were somewhere. We think of our relationships as eternal relationships. So if you're a mother with a child, then there's a good chance that you think, this is my eternal relationship. I will always be the mother of this child. And the problem with that is that, at least according to the Bhagavad-gita, you will be your child's parent in this life, and then maybe in a future life, your child will be your parent. They're someone else's child now if you haven't had them yet. So bodily relationships are subject to causeless perplexity. They're entangling. We become invested in these relationships. I was speaking to a good friend of mine about this. She has kids who are now just heading out to college. And she was talking to me about how, when her children are very young, she's the complete controller. She's got a conception of who they are. She's in charge of everything. They have to do what she says. Then they get older and they start to make their own decisions, and they're not necessarily the ones she would like them to make. And the reality now dawns on her that they could choose partners she doesn't like, or something could happen in their life that would be, something that very unfortunate, or they're going to get married to a wonderful person and have children, and then she will have grandchildren. And now she'll be absorbed in grandmotherly affection instead of motherly affection. And what happens is it's binding. Even though these relationships are all temporary, you get wrapped up in them, and they reinforce your sense of identity with your body. So this attachment is a function of illusory reasoning, which comes about by virtue of material intelligence or small intelligence. So the Sanskrit word for illusory reasoning is anyatha buddhi, and for small intelligence is alpa medhasam. Whereas detachment is a function of asakta buddhi, liberating reasoning. And that comes about by virtue of Atma Medhasam, excuse me, spiritual intelligence, or being well versed in spiritual knowledge. And that brings us back to the two different kinds or general categories of intelligence that we spoke about earlier. Medhā is the kind of intelligence that Krishna, the word that Krishna uses to describe the kind of intelligence he is for women. And buddhi, which shows up more often in the Bhagavad-gita, is a different kind of intelligence which has to do with the discernment between spirit and matter. The kind of reasoning that facilitates the actual experience of the distinction between spirit and matter. So buddhi and medhā. Medhā inspires buddhi. Spiritual knowledge inspires the experience of the distinction between spirit and matter, and detachment from matter and identity with spirit. Yet, detachment is said to be more difficult for women. Why? Here are the four reasons. The first is that women are directly affected by the cycles of material nature, psychophysically, in ways that men are not. They have a direct physical connection to their children in the way that fathers do not. They have a practical need for family stability in order to take care of and protect their children. And emotionally, they're better at community, they're better at relationships, and they want and need those things. Now, I am once again painting in very broad strokes to make what I will claim are reasonable generalizations that the Bhagavad-gita and the Vedic tradition from which the Gita comes also makes. Obviously, not all women are like this, or will have these kinds of responses to nature. Everyone has an individual nature nested in a larger nature, and there are as many variations of natures as there are people. But this is why when you hear that yoga wisdom texts in the Vedic tradition consider women to be less intelligent, it's a bad way of talking about the difference between buddhi and medhā. Embodied spirituality is one way that we find people in modern yoga like to deal with this. It's a euphemism for materialism. It basically says that your body is actually spirit. Now, to my ears, that sounds like insisting that a fish is a banana. A fish does not become a banana just because you say it's a banana. Which brings us to another showstopper, which is the Bhagavad-gita delivers messages that we don't want to hear, which is this idea that, well, if we're eternal spiritual beings, then the relationship I have with my family right now is temporary, not eternal. I want it to be eternal. I don't want to hear this. I'm out of here. This is a challenge. Spiritual knowledge does not have an obligation to conform to our desires. And the Bhagavad-gita has a message that is just as difficult for Arjuna to accept as it may be for any of us to accept as well. Okay, so now this brings us to the question, can women do yoga? The yoga described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are not the most suitable. In fact, actually, they're not suitable for men either. Nobody can actually do this anymore. Because Patanjali's system is for renunciates, out here, gone from the world, and off to the forest. Most people are not going to be able to do that. Alistair, got your question or comment, and I'm going to get to you. Bhakti yoga, on the other hand, is the most suitable and, as we will find as we go through the Gita, the highest form of yoga, according to Krishna in the Bhagavad-gita. He comes back to it over and over again as the essential element of every yoga practice and the ultimate fulfillment of every yoga practice that's spoken of in the Gita. Karma yoga, the eightfold path of mysticism, Patanjali's system, and jnana yoga all rely on and resolve in bhakti. And bhakti yoga, yoga of devotion, is the yoga of relationships, which is exactly, in the most essentialist conception of things, is what women are good at. Begins with receptivity, not your false ego. This plays actually against men's strengths because men are not, now once again, speaking very essentially, great at relationships. And they want to do things on their own. They want to be the source of their own deliverance by their own effort. Okay, now we have a comment quickly from Alistair. Everyone who exists is going to die. So what Krishna is telling us is that though it appears that everyone who comes into being will go out of being, what's actually going out of being is the body. I was once in a little child body. Now I'm in a much older body. The little child body is gone. I'm still here. There are even a few people left in the world who remember me in that little child body. And think of me as being the same person. And I remember the experience, so, you know, I must be still the same person in some sense, even though my personality has changed, my mind has changed, my tastes have changed. When I was in a little toddler body, there was no way you were going to get me to eat broccoli rabe. Now, I think it's great. So these things change. The body changes, the mind changes. The person is still the same person going through all of these experiences. So from Krishna's point of view, what he's telling us is bodies come and go, but the person in the body remains always. All right, so a quick wrap up. The Yoga of Discernment continues throughout the rest of the second chapter. We've covered verses 1 through 12. Arjuna's confusion and request for guidance, Krishna's very first instruction, and we have finally returned to the issue of detachment from family affection and its role in yoga. We have just a few minutes for any questions that you may have, and while I am waiting for your questions, if you want to send me questions later, of course, you can always do so. Hari@Hari-kirtana.com. I'm always very happy to hear from you. Meanwhile, next week, our special guest will be Dhanadhar Swami, and we will be looking at chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. So we'll revisit Krishna's first instruction, use that as a jumping off point to discuss how Krishna elaborates on this idea that we are not these material bodies. And Dhanadhar Swami is going to specifically speak with us about smooth sailing in rough seas, how one remains equipoised in all circumstances. And we'll talk a little bit more about śrī-bhagavan uvāca, the position of the personality of Godhead. Other resources, if you have not already done so, please go to my website and download the free audio class, Awaken Your Spiritual Vision. It's a 45-minute audio class that is a way to experience precisely this kind of teaching, turning it in from theoretical knowledge to experiential knowledge. My book has a chapter on karma and samsara, which we just began to touch on. So if you would like to pick that up and get a little deeper into that aspect of yoga philosophy, I have a chapter in my book on that. So, any last questions? Alrighty then. I will look forward to seeing you once again next week. Recordings will go out tomorrow. And once again, if you have any other questions, by all means, please write to me. I always look forward to hearing from you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.